Good evening, everyone. I figured I'd take a little moment to maybe come back. I felt so good about talking to you all about the digestive system. I figured I would do it again. This time, though, we're going to talk about the urinary system. So I'm going to be honest, 90% of this, we're going to be talking about kidneys. And then we'll talk about some of the other stuff later. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So, the urinary system, we're going to talk about general overview first. Urinary system has three functions. It's excretion of wastes that are in body fluids generated by cellular activity. The elimination of those wastes, so we're going to take them from the blood and then we're going to expel them from the body. This waste for the urinary system is urine. And then homeostatic regulation, blood volume, blood pressure, solute concentration, stuff like that. Your kidneys are really important for maintaining blood volume, and we're going to talk about that real briefly. So we're looking at the organs of the urinary system. We're going to start with the kidneys. They're paired organs that are actually more towards the posterior. They're the ones that actually filter the blood and produce the urine. Then we have the what's known as the urinary tract. That's the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. And those are all responsible for the elimination part. The ureters are paired organs, one per each kidney, that lead down into the bladder. The urinary bladder is a muscular sac, basically, kind of like the gallbladder, that temporarily stores urine before elimination. Urination is the actual process of the urine leaving the body. It exits by way of the urethra. And the process of urination, or micturition, there you go, you learned something today. That's the actual process of elimination, and that's brought about by contraction of muscles around that bladder and within the tissues of the bladder, forcing urine out of the body through the urethra. There we go. So, homeostatic functions, dealing a lot of stuff with the blood, right? So we're regulating blood volume and blood pressure by adjusting the volume of water lost in urine. So very concentrated versus very dilute. Also releasing erythropoietin and renin. Erythropoietin is a hormone responsible for controlling red blood cell production in the bone marrow, if you remember. And then renin is another hormone that is part of the renin-angiotensin system that is primarily responsible for regulating blood pressure and fluid balance. And basically, the more fluid you have in your veins, the higher your blood pressure. The less fluid, more dehydrated you are, the lower your blood pressure. Urinary system is also going to regulate blood plasma ions. We're talking sodium, potassium, chloride, other ions like bicarbonate, calcium, which is going to change the osmotic balance and drive water movement. And what else? We're stabilizing blood pH. We don't want it to get too far away from that neutral 7, so we're going to control how much hydrogen and bicarbonate. Those are the two things that are going to change pH, and that's chemistry. We're also going to conserve nutrients, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, stuff like that. And a lot of those things, they will end up in the urine temporarily, but then they get put back out. We're going to talk about what it means if you see some of those products. Now, urea and uric acid, those are the wastes. We want those to leave. It also helps out with the liver with the filtering process. It detoxifies toxins and poisons, stuff like that. So, looking at the organs in a little bit greater detail, we're going to start with the kidneys. Kidneys are paired organs. They're located on either side of the vertebral column. So here they are, as you can see. A little bit high. They're kind of high up above your pelvis, right around where the the very bottom thoracic vertebrae, the very top lumbar vertebrae. They are outside of the body cavity. They are retroparietal. And if you notice, the left kidney is slightly higher than the right kidney. Each kidney is wrapped by tissue, but we'll get to that. There's some other stuff that I forgot about. Important thing to notice is the adrenal glands, which sit on top, superior to the kidneys, and we talked about those just a little bit. That's your fight or flight response thing. The position is maintained by the organs around it, the peritoneum in front of it, other supporting connective tissues and stuff like that. Looking at some of the connective tissues that are holding all of that stuff together. So we're going to be focusing on this part right here. Okay. We've got the fibrous capsule, and that's basically the tissue that wraps around the kidneys. You may have noticed by now that pretty much all of the organs have some sort of connective tissue that wraps around them. The heart had the pericardium, right? All of the organs in the abdominal cavity have the peritoneum. And so the fibrous capsule is what it does it for the kidneys. Then we have the perinephric fat, which is a thick layer of fatty tissue. That's this stuff right here that kind of looks like corn. Then we have the renal fascia, that is fibrous connective tissue that covers the outer surface, including those fatty deposits. So that's this part right here. Then we have that's it. All right, keep on keeping on. All right, so now we're kind of digging in a little bit more. Typical kidneys, they're about 10 centimeters long, so that's a third of a foot, 4 inches, let's say, 5.5 centimeters wide, and 3 centimeters thick. So they're not too big. They're not the most giant things. They weigh about 150 grams. What's interesting, though, is the amount of blood volume that they process, though, is tremendous. It's a big chunk of how much blood is actually going through your body. It's pretty cool. One important feature of the kidney is this little section right here. It's called the hilum. That's on the medial side, so towards the midline. That's where the renal arteries and the renal nerves come in, and that's where the renal veins and the ureters come out. And it kind of acts like a funnel, and that's super important as far as the internal anatomy is concerned, which we're going to look at right now. So if you were to cut a kidney open, now some of y'all may have seen the inside of kidneys. They're pretty popular cuisine. Supposedly they're really, really good for you. Maybe if some of y'all have tried it, you can let us know. They're pretty tasty. Barbecued, stewed, I don't know, whatever. So we're going to look inside here. We have the renal sinus, that's the first part, and that's sort of like an empty cavity, basically, that is lined with fibrous tissue that helps keep the shape of the kidney. It also stabilizes the ureter, all the blood vessels, and all the nerves. And you can kind of see some of those blood vessels hanging out of the back. Okay, then we've got the renal cortex. The renal cortex is this outside part right here. Okay, very fibrous. It's the most superficial region of the kidney. It's reddish-brown, very granular looking. I've got another picture. I'll show you what that means just a little bit. If you look at these individual divisions right here, these triangle shape, they kind of look maybe like pie wedges because I'm kind of hungry, are the renal pyramids, and this is where the magic happens. Okay, within that is the renal medulla, where all the nephrons are. We're going to tell you what the nephron is if you've never heard that before. There are 6 to 8 of these pyramids in the kidneys, sort of wrapping around that renal sinus. The base of each pyramid sits in the cortex, so here's the base right here, and the tip right here sits in it projects into the renal sinus, and it's sort of like a focusing, like a funnel, kind of. In between the renal pyramids, which are these spaces right here and right here, are the renal columns, also granular, and they are primarily responsible for its tissue that separates the pyramids. Then we have the altogether, like a functional unit, is called the kidney lobe, and the kidney lobe is the renal pyramid, the section of the cortex immediately superficial to the base, and the renal columns on either side. Within those, we've got ducts called renal papillae that are at the very tips right here. And those are responsible for discharging urine into something called the minor calyx, which is this region right here, immediately interior to the renal papillae. So these little spaces right here, and those are collecting points. They're kind of like cups, basically, that collect the urine from these different renal pyramids. You'll have several minor calyxes that will feed into a major calyx. I choose a different color. So you can see there's two minor calyxes that feed into that one major calyx. And then the major calyxes will actually all come together until we get to the renal pelvis. Where's my renal pelvis? Which is this whole section right here. Very large, funnel-shaped. It's formed by two or more major calyxes. It takes up most of the space of the renal sinus, and it's responsible for basically connecting all of the inner parts of the kidney and collecting all of that urine and then shunting it down the ureter into the bladder. And so that's the major parts of the inside of the kidney. Here's an actual kidney, and you can still see a lot of those structures. You can still see that renal sinus right here. You can see, I apologize. You can still see the renal sinus right in here. You can still see that granular nature of the renal cortex and those renal columns right here. You can see the renal pelvis right here. And here's that hilum. There's that sort of divot space right there. Now in a whole kidney, the ureter and all of these other tubes and whatnot would basically just sort of like hang out of this middle hilum part right there. So what do we got? Now let's talk about blood supply then real quick. Lots of stuff going on. There's a lot of blood volume that comes through. So basically what we have, we've got the renal arteries. Those are going to come in and bring in 20 to 25% of your total blood volume into your kidneys at any given moment. So, I mean, of course, it's not 100% of your blood volume at any given moment because your blood has to be other places. But your kidneys are filters. Think of like pool filters, aquarium filters, okay? They have a certain rate, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. About each minute, 1,200 milliliters, 1.2 liters, are going to pass into your kidney. And so they're very active. I guess it's a good thing we have two. So all of that blood, that 1,200 milliliters a minute, is going to come into the renal artery, and then it's going to branch off one of the segmental arteries right here. You can see that a little bit better if I change the color. And then from there, it's going to go to the interlobar arteries, and so that's these ones right here that are sort of wrapping around the renal pyramids. From there, those are going to branch off into the articulate arteries, arcuate arteries, which are these little ones right here. And then from there, they're going to go into the cortical radiate arteries, which are the teeniest, tiniest little ones right there. And then, here, let me back up just a second. So right here, these ones are the arcuate arteries. These are the cortical radiate like radius. They're radiating out from the side, right? From that point, then, where the blood goes is the something called the afferent arteriole, which we're going to look at that, going into the nephron itself, and then it comes back out. I would suggest, because we're going to talk about this sort of in pieces, you may write this down and put it off to the side, and then we'll come back to it once we're done with all of the like filtration part here in just a second. Because once we get to the cortical radiate artery, the afferent arteriole is going to bring blood into something called the nephron. And a part of the nephron that comes in direct contact with the blood is the glomerulus, which I believe is coming up right about now-ish. So after the blood is going to come down, if you look, so here's the afferent, no, there we go. Here's the afferent arteriole. And remember, an arteriole is just a really teeny tiny artery, not quite a capillary yet. It's the smallest arterial vessel that we have. It's going to come into something called a nephron, and this is the functional unit of the kidney. They're microscopic, so keep that in mind. We're talking like individual cells thick. Each one consists of two parts. Okay, the first part is the renal corpuscle, also known as the glomerulus. I'm going to keep practicing on that one. I was practicing before I came in here, but I haven't quite gotten it down yet. So the renal corpuscle, which is much easier to say, and the renal tubule right there. The renal corpuscle is responsible for the filtering part. The renal tubule is responsible for the actually generating of the urine. Starting with the first part, the blood's going to be coming in to the renal corpuscle. Now, the renal corpuscle is made up of two parts. The glomerular, or the Bowman's capsule. See, we should just call it Bowman's capsule. And the glomerulus, which is also known as the capillary network. Okay, so we've got the... Here, let me get rid of my... We've got the glomerulus, which is this part right here, this sort of nasty red knot. And then the actual capsule, which is the tissue that goes around it. So let's maybe see if we can zoom in a little bit more on that one. So the glomerular capsule. It's also super late, so that's the outer wall, basically, of the renal corpuscle. It encapsulates the capillary network, and it is a continuous, it just flows continuously. There's no clean break between that and the renal tubule parts. Now we'll get to that in a little bit. The glomerulus is a collection of about 50 capillaries, all intertwined together, and you can see them all together like a big knot. Blood is delivered through the afferent arteriole, mixes in with the glomerular capillary. Y'all know what I mean, right? Read my mind, not my lips. And then it leaves through the efferent arteriole after getting all mixing up and doing all the filtering and stuff like that. What's special about the glomerular capillaries is that they are fenestrated capillaries. And remember, so fenestrated. I don't know if you remember this when we talked about it during the cardio unit. Fenestrated capillaries are capillaries that have big old holes in them, so they can let a lot of stuff go through. And we want to have a lot of stuff go through, right? Every time your heart beats, you're filtering your blood and then putting it right back into the system. So we want to get this stuff out fast, but it's very selective. We're going to get into greater detail about that later on. Within the glomerular capillaries, we can look at the actual membrane, okay? And so the membrane consists of a fenestrated endothelium. That's the inner layer, okay? The little holes are those are the fenestrations. Fenestration, they're the ports, they're the holes, the windows, right? And then just outside of that, this dark line right here is the basement membrane, which also is sort of selectively permeable, right? And then there's something called the foot processes of podocytes. That's these things right here. They kind of look like triangles, okay? And they go all the way around. And those also help filter things from coming across. During filtration, basically what's going to end up happening is blood pressure. Here's a red blood cell of the going into the capillaries is going to force liquid through this filtration membrane, keeping larger solutes like big complicated proteins and and large biomolecules from passing through the membrane. They're going to stay in the blood, so we're going to get water and very small solutes, things dissolved in it, like ions, sodium, for example. Okay, it's essentially protein-free. And one of the things that we're going to be using a lot as we're going through this, so maybe write it down, is something called filtrate. Filtrate is the stuff left over after you filtered out something else. What's a good example? If you make tea in a loose leaf press, okay, if you know what that is, stay with me. If not, maybe Google it. After you remove the stuff, the loose tea leaves, and you pour out your tea, your filtrate is the tea. Pool filters or aquarium filters, if you have liquid left over and you sort of squeeze that out when you're cleaning out your filters and doing regular maintenance, the filtrate is the stuff that you separated that ended up not going back into your fish tank. That's filtrate. We're going to use that a lot. In humans, it's a liquid. It's pretty much always a liquid. Now, we've talked about a little bit of the filtering of the renal corpuscle. Let's talk about the renal tubule. There's two parts. They are convoluted segments. There's the proximal, the closer end. That's this part right there. And then we've got the distal end, that's this part right there. Now, sometimes you may see, and you probably will see, proximal convoluted tube shortened to PCT, and distal convoluted tube shortened to DCT. Because proximal convoluted tubule is a lot to say. So PCT, DCT. They are separated by a single U-shaped strand right here called the nephron loop, or more commonly known to as the loop of Henle. On his off days of being a singer of a major rock group, apparently he also names organs. That's not true. They actually named that hundreds of years ago. I said it was late. It also extends partially into the medulla, if you think back of the triangle parts of the kidneys. And so basically what's going to end up happening is your tubular fluid. Okay, so the tubular fluid, that's not the fluid that's like super rad and crap like that. This is the stuff that's inside this tube. One thing that's really helpful to think about this, at least for me, think about this as a hose, okay? So water hose, you turn the water on, the water's flowing through the hose. The water in the hose is your tubular fluid, because we can have something else called peritubular fluid. That's the fluid outside of it. That's kind of like if you have a soaker hose. Okay, so water's leaching out of that into these other spaces. That's peritubular fluid. So the tubular fluid is going to change composition. It's going to get more concentrated, less concentrated, basically. That has to do with water being absorbed and reabsorbed, and solutes being secreted and then reabsorbed and secreted and reabsorbed and stuff like that. So the first part, the proximal tubule, is the entrance. It connects directly to the renal corpuscle, and its primary function is the reabsorption of ions. So we're going to look at this in a little bit, but I also mentioned it. Small things in water are going to come across that the fenestrations of the glomerular capillaries. Okay, well, a lot of those ions, we still need those, so we want them back. That's what's going to happen in the proximal convoluted tube. Once we get past that to the descending, so right here, it's getting into the descending end of the loop of Henle. The fluid's going to flow towards the renal pelvis, so kind of towards the center. And then the ascending limb, it's going to bring it back up. And then after it comes back up, it's going to go to the distal convoluted tubule. And the main part of that one, that's the third portion of the whole renal tubule. And basically, that one is going to reabsorb water and certain ions, leaving wastes behind. It's smaller in diameter than the proximal tubule, so that's going to sort of force stuff out, and it's going to keep the pressure going so it can push all the way through. After you go through the actual nephron and get that filtering and that concentration process going, then what you're going to do is you're going to go into the collecting system. And so the collecting system is a series of tubes that carry this tubular fluid eventually out of the body. And so we have collecting ducts, which are all connected to nephrons. So all of these little branches right here, those are all connected to nephrons. Each collecting duct begins in the cortex on that outer edge. It's going to descend into the medulla, and then it's going to carry fluid to the papillary duct, which are these right here. And then that's eventually going to drain. Let me back up. So the papillary duct is actually this part right here. And then this is going to drain into the minor calyx, which remember we said is this sort of cup shape collecting surface, like a siphon or a funnel or something like that. You also have a little bit of a fluid composition adjustment here, not a whole ton. You will have some ADH. I think I mentioned that a little bit later. It's going to start acting up here right before it hits the collecting system and stuff like that. Your final concentration of urine is going to be decided here, because then at that point we're out of absorptive surfaces within the calyxes and the ureter and stuff like that, and so it's just transport at that point. What do we got? All right, we'll go ahead and call it there. We got a lot of stuff going on that we just covered, so we want to give that a chance to sink in. You're going to need to know the terminology pretty well, especially once we start talking about the actual function, which is in the next video. So if you need to go back and review this one, review some of the terms and stuff like that, make sure you're square on the different sections and stuff like that, especially of the nephron, that functional unit. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and move on to the next video where we're looking at renal physiology.